For everyone with an interest in MASH or more broadly, steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up. Season 6, Episode 5 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami starts now.
For the last 5 years, MASLD stakeholders, whether manufacturers, trial sites, providers, payers, patients, or investors, have turned to Surfing the MASH Tsunami to keep track of drug and device development, epidemiology, public health initiatives, and practice patterns. This weekend, we are sharing the 3 main sections from our Episode 5. This month's Roundtable, which is dedicated to the memory of our co-founder, Dr. Stephen Harrison, looks deeply into recent advances in drug development. Our Newsmaker discussion with Dr. Naga Chalasani of the University of Indiana reviews his group's recent article in Hepatology Communications magazine. And our expert interview with Dr. Scott Friedman focuses on recent advances in basic MASH research that teach us more about the basic MASLD/MASH disease, with significant implications for future generations of MASH drugs. This week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
As a field, this is very exciting. This is the first positive trial in a cirrhotic population showing a reversal on biopsy. So I think it's a game changer.
In the cirrhotic population, depending on how we select the patients, the outcomes are not 20 years down the line. We're seeing sooner impacts. It's reasonable to propose these outcomes trials moving forward.
And if you do not have that formal regression of cirrhosis, but you have an impact on portal hypertension, you will have an impact on the prognosis of these patients and their evolution towards decompensation.
We've got to do great PR to reverse the common philosophy that cirrhosis is irreversible, because that's been the long thought out theme throughout medicine and most other areas.
When medical team members would come and visit us, they would ask us, would you be able to talk to providers in Michigan or Arkansas to see how we set that up? So we thought instead of talking to so many people, we thought we would just publish so people can actually have access to the mechanics.
What companies have done is say, well, let's try to introduce the protective gene variant in patients with gene therapy, and the early results look very promising. But it suggests now that variants in relevant diseases caused by genes are also a target for gene therapy.
This week's sponsors for Surfing MASH include
LiverRight and the LiverRight Scanning Network. On April 15th, 2025, LiverRight will open America's first virtual specialty clinic for liver disease, offering adults in all 50 states video appointments and helping GI practices and health systems triage and treat the swelling numbers of patients seeking MASLD and MASH testing. LiverRight offers same-week video visits and accepts insurance. For more information, contact LiverRight, that's liver, and then RIGHT at www.liverright.com.
Tawazin Health, your partner in global liver health innovation. At Tawazin Health, we specialize in providing small or large-scale access to FibroScan examinations for liver health-focused early detection, clinical trials, independent research, and collaborative projects with clinicians and FibroScan providers increasingly throughout the world. As industry-leading experts, we design and deliver high-quality FibroScan services because we know that accurate, high-quality, reliable data drives better outcomes. To learn about our sister lifestyle app, mylife365.me, click the Tawazin Health link on the Surfing MASH homepage.
Hi there, and welcome to Episode 5 of Season 6. You might notice that while my voice is better, it's far from back to normal, and I apologize for any scratchiness or roughness of my voice in general. This episode starts a new roundtable cycle for us. The roundtable is on drug development and is dedicated to the memory of our co-founder, Dr. Stephen Harrison, clearly a leading light in MASH drug development over the last 30 years. Today's segment looks mostly at the FGF-21 class, a drug class about which Stephen was always highly enthusiastic. Our Newsmaker interviews with Dr. Naga Chalasani of the University of Indiana. Naga joins us to discuss a paper his group published recently in Hepatology Communications describing their early experiences in prescribing Resmetirom and getting it approved with payers. And finally, our expert interview with Scott Friedman focuses largely on some exciting recent findings that will affect the next generation of MASH drugs, in some cases what's in them, and in some cases how they're delivered.
First, our roundtable discussion. Drug Development Deep Dive, Part 1. Jörh, Louise, and Roger are joined by hepatologists and key opinion leaders, Professor Sven Francque and Dr. Naim Alkhouri. Today, the discussion focuses on the FGF-21 class of agents.
let's start with our first session of the day, which is our roundtable. Our roundtable this month is on drug development. This will be something we'll be doing annually every April in honor of our friend Stephen, since it's in the period between when Resmetirom was approved and when, unfortunately, he passed last year. And in fact, next week we'll be doing an episode dedicated to Stephen and issues around Stephen and Summit, and drug development seemed like an appropriate part of that. With us, we've got Jörh, who is driving. Jörh, how are the roads today in Germany?
It's good. It's good. Again, just past Ramstein, U.S. Air Base here. Actually, we're happy about some rain these days because it's been a little bit droughty here. So things are good.
Good to hear that. And we have about half of Naim who'll be with us for the first half to two-thirds of this session. Then you'll have to leave. Naim, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure to have you join us, my friend. And then for the first time in a bit, we've got Sven Francque with us. Sven, how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. I'm happy to be with you.
You look tremendously relaxed and just back from holiday. Now, I know that already, but...
I had my Easter holiday last week, yes.
And we'll talk about that on Groundbreakers. And then we have Louise, whose Liverpool team is streaming towards the Premier League title, whatever else is happening with them. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you very much. And we're getting rain for the first time in about 3 weeks. And I'm sitting in a glass room, so you might hear it in the background, but I'll be on mute most of the time for that. It's nice, it's welcome for a day.
I will also be on mute most of the time because we have no rain here this morning, but I am still harboring the laryngitis and bronchial yuck that affected me last week. So if my voice doesn't sound great, that's fine, and I will be on mute, and these folks will watch me hacking and whatever else I'm doing in the meantime. With that, why don't we go to Groundbreakers? One piece of good news from the last week or so. Sven, why don't you go first, because I think I know where you can talk about your holiday a little bit, and then everyone else can go after that.
Now that my holiday is over, that's not a good news, of course, for me, but I much enjoyed it. I spent a few days in Spain, in Marbella, and, well, with the climate change, the weather was better in Belgium even than in Spain, but still we had a great holiday. So charging batteries from time to time is what a human should do.
And professionally?
Professionally, everything quiet. Looking forward to the EASL Congress in 2 weeks, which is, of course, for the EASL Governing Board, a huge amount of work of preparation, but we're looking forward to a great Congress again in Amsterdam. So.
Well, for everything Alexander said on our episode last week, it should be fantastic. He really quite raved about it.
Oh, yeah. A lot of new, exciting things to pick up there.
And with that, brave one, go next.
I'll go next. I have my spring break with the kids coming up next week, so we'll be going to Honolulu, and I know my kids will be surfing. I'll be just hanging out in the ocean, so I'm excited for that. On a professional note, we got the late breakers, notifications from EASL, and we have some exciting stuff that I'll be presenting, including the data from the galectin program with belapectin in patients with cirrhosis, MASH cirrhosis, and evidence of portal hypertension. We also have some promising data from the Madrigal cirrhosis program looking at changes in NITs. So more to come on this, but very exciting stuff that will be presented at the late breaking session on Saturday during EASL.
Fantastic. And while Jörh is still on mute, Louise, why don't you go next? And then Jörh will come off mute.
I love Honolulu. You've got to go up to Fumi's. It's like a little shack type thing that does the best shrimp in the area. And it's an experience, that's all I'll say. So the girls will love it. Actually, my positive of the week is we have had the first woman of colour, Dr. Mumtaz Patel, now voted in as the president of the Royal College of Physicians. Now, she was acting president when I got my graduation. So she was really supportive. As you can understand, as the only nurse that's ever been given an FRCP, it's quite an intimidating place and surrounded by lots of physicians. So she was very welcoming, very supportive, and it's great to see the Royal College of Physicians leading with women of strength in different areas. So I'm going to congratulate her and the move with the Royal College of Physicians today.
Hear, hear, as do we all. Okay, Jörh, you're up.
Yes, of course, also personally, Easter holiday break coming up. I'll take the holiday, some time off with the family. That will be very nice. We'll go to northern Italy or Südtirol, as we call it. So looking forward to that. And then soon after that, EASL is coming up, and I can also feel the heat. I'm not part of the governing board as Sven, but I see how well a job they did organizing many things. I've been in contact with the EASL core team, and I'm happy to support the meeting, of course. So I agree, the late breakers. Naim's going to present data that will be of interest. Parallel session, there's going to be one I'm cheering on new therapeutics, and of course a number of poster presentations that are being ready. I think the deadline for poster upload was just around the corner, and I think there's another one next week. So really a lot of stuff, a lot of emails flying around on that part of data being put into EASL.
Deadlines are right around the corner. A lot of presentations, a lot of exciting things happening at EASL.
That's exactly right.
I guess my best news is that I'm not dead yet. All facetiousness aside, I've been wrestling with this bronchial sinus all-over infection. I think you heard it in my voice last week. You'll hear it again in my interview with Scott Friedman, which I did yesterday, and with Naga Chalasani, which I'm doing later today. I'm going to allow these folks to do most of the talking while I go on silent. But other than that, very excited about EASL, and we'll talk about this in the business report, but thanks to you folks, the return numbers on the podcast have been far better than what I expected, and more cards and letters. Well, not cards, but letters, and emails and text messages, so thanks for all that. And with that, we will roll ahead. This roundtable will cover the next 4 episodes, and we'll be talking about drug development. It's been, as Mazen pointed out in his summary last week, it's been a fantastic year for drug development, and I'd like to take some time and go through the various important pieces in order. Naim, since you're only with us for half the session, why don't you pick what we talk about first?
We can talk about exciting data with FGF-21, if that's of interest.
Let's start there. That's fine. Go ahead.
One of the biggest news is data we saw in the SYMMETRY trial. This was, a study that looked at patients with MASH cirrhosis. They had biopsy at baseline and then biopsy at 96 weeks. And we actually saw a significant improvement in fibrosis in a cirrhotic patient population, with 39% regressing from F4 to F3 fibrosis with the high-dose Efruxifermin. So this is very exciting. The abstract will be presented at EASL at one of the plenary sessions. I think publication will follow. But for us, as a field, this is very exciting. This is the first positive trial in a cirrhotic population showing a reversal on biopsy. So I think it's a game changer. Obviously, the sample size is small. We need to have, a large phase 3 to confirm this, which is ongoing now. This is part of the AKIRA 106 trial that's looking at patients with MASH cirrhosis. But what was exciting is that this improvement in cirrhosis was noted in the per protocol analysis, but also in the intent to treat analysis, which gives us more confidence that the signal is true. And I hope that we can confirm this also with the other FGF-21 agonist. We have some preliminary data with Efruxifermin in a small cohort of cirrhotics showing improvement. We have promising data with the Efruxifermin and non-cirrhotics, but hopefully we can demonstrate efficacy in a cirrhosis population. I think this is the highest unmet need now. These patients don't have any FDA-approved therapeutic options. Resmetirom is still not indicated in cirrhotics, but we're also seeing some promising data from the open-label cirrhosis program with Resmetirom. And then we have the MAESTRO-NASH outcomes trial. It's ongoing, and we should have the results in the next couple of years.
I was going to underline what Naim said, that obviously the cirrhotic population is one of the biggest unmet needs. As hepatologists and the people on this call and the one you have later in the podcast are obviously seeing those patients, and we have hardly anything to offer them. Now, the ability to reverse, I would say, early histologically confirmed cirrhosis, these are not the decompensated patients that are showing up late in our clinics, is a groundbreaker. And I'm really excited to see the phase 3s rolling out. And this fits into a landscape where we have FDA-approved treatment for non-cirrhotic MASH, as Naim mentioned, first in class, a situation where there's probably additional compounds coming down the pipeline that have increased efficacy. And it's so exciting to see actually movement on both frontiers in terms of the disease stage, cirrhotic and non-cirrhotic patients.
Sven, Louise, go ahead. I have a couple of questions, but someone else go ahead first if you'd like.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things here for me is that we clearly see those results in a difficult to treat population, or a population in which it's difficult to demonstrate benefit. So these are very powerful results, and they probably relate to the mode of action of the FGF-21s with their, of course, they have pleiotropic effects, but one of the important important ones is, of course, their effect on the adipose tissue and the function of the adipose tissue. And what we saw, for example, with the GLP-1s is that, I think Naim was one of the important coordinators of that study, that there was, in terms of fibrosis regression or cirrhosis regression, another positive result, which does not mean that they do not have a benefit, because that's not an outcome trial. I'm quite confident that if you would go for outcomes, that knowing the effect of the GLP-1s, there would be some benefit also in patients with cirrhosis, but not very powerful in terms of having regression of cirrhosis with this compound, and probably also with other ones, due to their mode of action. Even if you have such a stringent endpoints as fibrosis regression of one stage in people that have already established cirrhosis, you have a positive result, which means that most probably in terms of clinical outcomes, it will be even more powerful. So I think that is the true highlight of these results, is that even in that population, you can achieve, depending the mode of action of drugs, you can achieve even going back one stage and having regression of cirrhosis, which is very powerful in terms, most probably, of later on clinical benefit, making this really a huge step forward. And again, we are heavily relying on histology. It's not so easy to have long-term outcome studies that are beyond any discussion you can have. But meeting this very high barrier endpoint is very promising and an important breakthrough in this field. So indeed, there is promise now, even in this category of patients, although I think that other drugs also might still have a benefit, but as I said, not powerful enough to meet those stringent endpoint of cirrhosis regression. But that's, of course, not the only thing you need to improve the outcome of patients. So the discussion about improving the outcomes and the endpoints is still something that we need to work on.
Just to follow up, Sven, I think we're much closer, though, right? And the non-cirrhotic trials, I agree, we have a long trail to outcomes, but we've been discussing that, and I'd be interested to hear also Naim's thought again. I mean, in the cirrhotic population, depending on how we select the patients, the outcomes are not 20 years down the line. This is something where we're seeing more sooner impacts. I think it's reasonable to propose these outcomes trials moving forward.
Yeah, sure. But you're absolutely right, and you're pointing to an important thing. It's about the selection of the patients, of course, in terms of having a reasonable number of outcomes in a reasonable time frame. And there the selection is, of course, key. But you're absolutely right. That's something which is more feasible than in early stage. Yeah, absolutely.
And in fact, the only data we have that histologic improvement leads to better outcomes comes from a cirrhotic population within the Gilead program, where we showed that patients that regress from F4 to F3, they have significantly lower rates of liver outcomes. This was a paper by Arun Sanyal from the Salon-Sertib program. So I think showing a reversal of F4 going to F3 is a very strong surrogate for outcomes. And I think, if we have a larger sample size, as a hepatologist, I will be convinced that these patients that go from F4 to F3 are less likely to develop outcomes. And of course, all these trials will follow patients for a longer period of time, and we will look at liver decompensating events, overall mortality, need for liver transplant, and changes in MELD score. And this will be a composite outcome-driven endpoint.
So, question for all of you. Mazen last week, and some of the discussion in earlier episodes about the Emerging Trends Conference, noted that in the Efruxifermin data presented there, while cirrhotic patients did not go all the way to portal hypertension, they had some pretty thick. It wasn't simply the patients with highly compensated cirrhosis, but they had some patients who were pretty close to portal hypertension in that trial, as suggested. I wonder if any of you can comment any more on that, based on data that you're allowed to share, or do we know anything more from other studies about what we might be able to see for compensated cirrhotic, patients with decompensated cirrhosis, or kind of at that borderline between the two?
So I would say, and Sven has done a lot of work on that, including the clinical significant portal hypertension. The progression along the spectrum of the severity of CSPH is something that is linked to outcome, and prevention of that progression is currently something we're studying in those trials. And I think that's another important surrogate that's feasible and doable in these settings. But maybe I'll hand it over to Sven to hear his expertise on the CSPH.
Yes, and the pattern of CSPH is also a little bit different than in alcohol-related disease or in viral hepatitis-related disease, for example. So, and it's a continuous spectrum, and that's also something we have to take into account. And it's not just the fibrosis that determines the portal hypertension. There's a lot of other mechanisms that contribute to it, and that's also one of the reasons why I said about the FGF-21s that their impact on adipose tissue function is an important one, because there's an important crosstalk drug between the liver on one side and the adipose tissue and the gut and some other organs on the other side. So there are a lot of driving factors for that portal hypertension. And so the improvement in that is also the add-on of different effects. And the fibrosis is only one component of that. And so the benefit of these drugs is beyond just their impact on fibrosis. Of course, we're looking at fibrosis or surrogate markers of it to have an idea about the efficacy of a drug, but there's way more than just that. And that's probably also one of the things that is more subtle, but if you can improve that, even if you do not have that formal regression of cirrhosis, and I agree with Naim, it's a very strong predictor of improved outcome, but even if you do not achieve that, but you have an impact on portal hypertension, you will have an impact on the prognosis of these patients and their evolution towards decompensation.
And just to follow up on this, Roger, we are including clinically significant portal hypertension as an endpoint in some trials. For example, with the survodutide, the dual agonist, GLP-1 and glucagon, we are looking at endoscopic endpoints, and we're including patients that progress to high-risk varices as one of the endpoints. I think this is going to help with potentially achieving more outcomes quickly so we can demonstrate efficacy benefit over placebo. Of course, survodutide, they have a small phase 1b trial where they showed safety, but maybe a hint on efficacy in patients with advanced disease, early decompensation, Child-Pugh-B. So that looks very promising. And then in the galectin trial, we actually included patients with clinically significant portal hypertension that was defined by low platelet count, having splenomegaly, or the presence of collaterals. But we did not include anyone that had varices at baseline, so that was an exclusion if they had any varices on the initial EGD. And then after we treated them, we did a second EGD to look at the percentage of patients that progressed to having varices. And these are the data that I will present at EASL. There was a press release, and if you look at the 2 milligram dose with belapectin, there was actually less progression to varices. So I think a very important endpoint, clinically significant portal hypertension. There are different ways to look at it, endoscopically or through the Baveno criteria, liver stiffness. And I think you're going to see more and more trials including this as an endpoint.
It's extremely exciting and encouraging, and we've got to do great PR to reverse the common philosophy that cirrhosis is irreversible, because that's been the long thought out theme throughout medicine and most other areas. So like hepatitis C being curable, we're now going to have to rewrite that book for everybody as well, which is excellent news and a great challenge. But managing patients today, Naim, what is the difference in the studies to standard of care? Do they get more physio? Do they get more input clinically to keep fitter and healthier around the medication that they're receiving? And if not, what can I take as a physician on the ground floor, seeing patients every day, saying, this is what's coming, this is how we keep you fitter, healthier now to be in the best position in the future?
Let me focus on patients with actually advanced disease, cirrhosis with clinically significant portal hypertension, because even before the clinical trials and approval of Resmetirom, we've had a lot to offer this patient population as hepatologists and gastroenterologists. When you have a patient with cirrhosis and clinically significant portal hypertension, of course they need HCC surveillance. So we start imaging plus AFP every 6 months. I think this is crucial. And this is true for all cirrhotics, with or without portal hypertension. But then in patients with portal hypertension also, it's imperative that we start carvedilol or a non-selective beta blocker. And we have data from a trial called the Predesky trial showing that you can actually delay decompensation. So this has been a very important thing that we can offer this patient population. And sometimes, unfortunately, in the real world, it's underutilized. We used to also offer the endoscopy routinely, and then, based on varices, no varices, decide on beta blockers. But now we realize that you can delay decompensation even in the form of ascites. So I think when I diagnose someone based on Baveno criteria or clinically significant portal hypertension, I automatically start them on carvedilol and then up titrate based on heart rate and tolerability to decrease the chances of decompensation. So these are things that that can be done today. They are allowed also to be done within the context of clinical trials, because we don't want to deny patients effective treatments because they are in a clinical trial. And then the lifestyle intervention is still crucial in this patient population, and weight loss is still important, and improving muscle function is very important to make sure that they don't keep progressing toward sarcopenia. We have data with bariatric surgery also that when you operate on patients with compensated cirrhosis, you can change outcomes. And we believe that this is mediated by the significant weight loss. So as Sven said, maybe GLP-1 receptor agonists didn't show improvement in cirrhotics on histology, but if you follow them long-term for outcomes, I do believe that they may show benefits.
In today's Newsmaker segment, hepatologist and key opinion leader Naga Chalasani of the University of Indiana shares insights from a paper his group published recently in Hepatology Communications titled Early Experience with Resmetirom to treat metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis with fibrosis in a real-world setting.
Today's Newsmaker conversation is with a new guest, Dr. Naga Chalasani of the University of Indiana. Naga, how are you this afternoon, sir?
I'm very good. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. As everybody who listens to the podcast knows, I've got a touch of bronchitis, a touch of laryngitis, but we got through the major recording this morning, and I'm still here, so I guess I'm doing all right. Right after Resmetirom was approved, maybe a couple of months later, we did a episode with Michael Charlton, which was about what the very, very early experience was with prescribing Resmetirom. At that point in time, he had maybe a dozen patients on it. I was talking about how it was going through his system. Well, so it's almost a year later. Michael is now working at Madrigal Pharmaceuticals, and Naga and some of his colleagues published an article in Hepatology Communications that went online last week about the first 6 months of their experience with Resmetirom. That's what we're going to talk about today, but before we get started, do me a favor, tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, nice to be on this podcast. My name is Naga Chalasani. I'm a hepatologist, and I practice, and I'm a researcher in the field of MASLD, MASH, going back to 25 years or so. I've been part of the national CRN, been heavily involved in the Resmetirom development program, and we've been very interested in the thyroid axis in MASLD, MASH, going back to 2000. And we're just pleased that our early experience was published in Hepatology Communications not too long ago.
And then can you tell our folks one more thing about yourself that they might not know if you didn't tell them, something a little different or surprising?
I am very much into fitness, and last summer I did the El Camino walk from Lugo to Compostela, Santiago de Compostela, and in about a month's time I'm doing the Italian Camino via Francigena from Tuscany for about 80 miles or so. That's sort of been exciting to me, these walking, hiking pilgrimages.
And over how many days will you be doing the 80-mile hike?
Approximately about 6.5 days of walking.
Okay. So that's quite a bit of walking a day, right? And the one in Spain was also about the same length?
Yeah.
Okay. How many Caminos are there besides Spain and Italy, for those who don't know, like me?
I mean, the two main ones, one is the Camino de Santiago. That's the whole thing is about 500 miles. Mm-hmm. We've only done the last part of it. And then the other Camino starts in Canterbury, UK to Rome. I understand that's about 3,000 miles.
Wow.
We're only doing a small part of it in Italy. The Italian one goes to Rome, whereas the one in Spain goes to Santiago, St. James Cathedral in Santiago.
Okay. Now, do you plan to do more parts of this route in future years?
You know what I'd like to do is, go back to Camino Santiago in Spain and do twice the distance. And I think there's a place you can start called Leon. And that's about 180 miles, and you can probably do in about 15 to 18 days. That's my goal. It's really transforming just to be able to day in and day out do these long walks, and you meet people from all over. That's, to me, it's been incredibly satisfying.
It sounds like a fantastic thing to do. Our engineer right now spent the weekend 4 or 5 day weekend doing the first part of a 270-mile trek through the Ozark Hills in Arkansas. It's broken into 11 stages, about 25 miles each.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I just think it's, somebody asked me halfway through Camino last year, what's your experience? And it's the freedom. It just feels so free. And then for your audience, I'll say one thing. I did that by myself, did not go with my spouse. And then my spouse had done the same about 2 years before what I had done. So there is freedom that, going by yourself. If you're going to do these 80 miles, and at least to me, just seems pretty liberating.
Fantastic. So that is the first time we've had somebody doing this kind of distance walking come on as a guest. We're up at about 150 different guests over time right now. So every time someone comes up with something that's truly unique, I'm delighted. Thank you very much for that. And with that, let's go to the article. For those who don't know and haven't seen notes on this yet, the article, Early Experience with Resmetirom to Treat Metabolic Dysfunction Associated Steatohepatitis with Fibrosis in a Real-World Setting. And that appeared, I want to say, end of March, maybe, or right at the beginning of April. Why did you and the team decide to put this particular article together? What motivated you to do it?
It seemed like we rapidly accumulated a fair bit of experience. We were hearing from Madrigal team that we are one of the larger prescribers in the country. And for those who aren't familiar with how Indiana is set up, we're the only liver transplant program, only hepatology program in the state of Indiana. So we have very large hepatology practice. And of course, we've been in the NASH space, and we have a number of patients who've been eagerly waiting for an approved therapy. So we accumulated this 100 plus patients very rapidly, and then that's one we wanted to share. Second is, since this medication is only available through selected pharmacies, we have set up processes that turned out to be quite effective for us. So we wanted to share how we have set up. When Madrigal team members would come and visit us, they would from time to time would ask us, would you be able to talk to providers in Michigan or providers in Arkansas to see how we set that up? So we thought instead of talking to so many people, we thought we would just publish so people can actually have access to the mechanics of from the time we write a prescription to the time a patient gets their supply in mail. What are the steps involved? That's the second thing. Third, sort of came later on. As we were putting the data together, we understood that how we set up the care pathway at our own system needed to be tweaked. And I'll just elaborate more on it, as the discussion goes on. So multiple reasons, those are sort of the primary reasons that we put the paper together and chose to publish.
So what was the specific goal of the paper or the objective that you were writing towards when you wrote it? What were we measuring?
Just really early experience with patient selection, care pathway, how we got the medicine to our patients, and just to describe the safety tolerability. Those are sort of the three main goals.
And by that standard, the prescription pathway worked effectively. About 1 in 6 discontinued, and you thought that you wrote in the conclusion to the abstract, at least, that might be mitigated somewhat if you paid more attention to the patients?
Yes. So the practice has about 10 plus clinical hepatologists and about 6 or so prescribing extenders, really fantastic, well-trained part of our group. We all are writing prescriptions. So we set up a process. The senior author of the paper, Dr. Samala, sort of championed this setting up the care pathway. We had a champion pharmacist who took upon themselves to serve as the pivot, to receive the referrals, to put the material together to the payers, and then to the pharmacy, the whole process. One of the things, take-home messages is if you are a high-volume prescriber where you have multiple providers, having a single source who administers is really critical. There are 2 ways to do it. So we chose an approach of a diverse pool of providers going through a single pharmacist. And there are practices where instead of single pharmacist, they have diverse group of hepatologists sending to one hepatologist. That way, one hepatologist sees and decides if the Resmetirom is the right treatment and the dose and so on and so forth. We chose that we wanted to keep a plan where hepatologists are still seeing their patients and the pharmacists are just helping with getting the drug approved and dispensed. And for us, I think when we put the paper together, this was in December, I think we had something like 114 patients we prescribed. 113 were approved by the payers. Some haven't started, some decided not to go on for a variety of reasons. At the same time, we had some clinical trials. They wanted to go into clinical trials for weight loss and so forth. Well, the way we set up worked quite beautifully for us.
So why did you choose to set it up that way as compared to setting up through physician? First of all, what is the benefit of setting it up with one central person being a decision point? And then why did you select to do it with a pharmacist as compared to the physician specifically?
I just think that one, though, is we collectively believed all of us are well versed with treating MASH, and they all could make the right decision in terms of choosing Resmetirom as therapy and then also the dose. We felt like they are, we all were collectively comfortable. We all can do it. And then also we have at least 2 sessions. When the package insert came, we went through line by line of package insert. And then we have come to sort of an internal consensus, what kinds of patients we wanted to treat and how we would like to do first year, followed by, once we have enough experience, what we would do subsequent year. So that helped us. So we felt like we didn't need to consolidate all referrals into one hepatologist. Yeah, I think we would do it all over again because I think it's just a very well-informed hepatologist and the extenders.
So you did that. You wrote maybe 1,314 prescriptions, virtually all of which went through. Yeah.
Except for one.
Okay.
All of them.
What was the key to all of them going through? Is there anything that people can learn about that?
Multiple things, though. One, I think all providers were on the same page because we went through as a group the package insert. We've discussed what kinds of patients we wanted to treat. So there was a general agreement. That's one. Number 2, I think the information that we were sending to the single source of truth, our pharmacist, was relatively consistent. And I would say our pharmacist was and is fantastic in terms of understood. This pharmacist has been with us going back to the direct-acting antiviral agents, the Hep C days. So you understood how this is done. It's not like the first time they were doing it. And then, of course, Madrigal has been very engaged helping the pharmacist. I think in a number of instances where we had to go back the first time, about 70% or so the first time went through, then we had to appeal again. And then if that appeal was turned down, always Madrigal was ready to step up and pick up, at least for first year, pick up the prescription. I can't remember how many we had. Also, the copay has been somehow managed with vouchers and so forth. So I would say having partnership with Resmetirom, we work closely with them. They had absolutely no say in how, who we treated. But when we needed help, they were there to help us to set up the care pathway.
Basically, they took all the economics out of the equation, right, if I understand correctly. If the patient was not approved by the insurer, they still would get the medication free of charge or deeply discounted charge.
I think so. I think if after 2 attempts, if the payer did not pay, my understanding is that Resmetirom covered, plus as well as the copay was somehow covered through vouchers. So overall, I think they've been good partners.
So then all the patients were covered. If I remember from the article correctly, of the 110 that you wrote about in the article, 83 actually went on the medication within 30 days?
Yeah.
Was there a reason that people didn't go on the medication that's worth mentioning?
Some I think in transit, Roger. Some I think they just had it, they haven't quite started. There isn't anything. I think some of these is when you have these early experience papers, you always have these transitions. Unlike a clinical trial where you have a data cutoff and you have a data hold type stuff. So yeah, there isn't anything. It is just the mechanics of how these things work.
What's the experience been on the drug?
The way we set up the follow-up, which we have since changed, once the patient gets the drug, the medication at home, we set up the first set of labs at 3 months and a visit with their provider in 6 months. And what I describe as prescribe and forget approach. This is how we have done with DAAs for Hep C because, they were so well tolerated. We would prescribe, they would take it for 2 months, then we had the lab draws and they come back and see us 6 months cured. So we just sort of replicated that, but we realized with this medication that prescribe and forget isn't the right approach. You needed to prescribe and follow, meaning some sort of a follow-up, even a phone call at 4 weeks. I think it's more important, less about the labs, but I would think if a phone call at first month and maybe at 3 months, so patients know if they have nausea or diarrhea, abdominal symptoms, you're talking to them, adjusting the dose if so needed. So that's our experience, and I think care pathway we put in wasn't quite right for this drug, at least for our population.
Okay, so when you say prescribe and forget, you literally mean no follow-up at all?
So any follow-up during that window, the way we set up is they get the medication. The first thing from our side is they go get labs in 3 months, and then they have a clinic visit in 6 months. Anything else had to be initiated by a patient rather than prescriptively from a provider. So we didn't forget them, but the burden we left up to patients. Some called. When they had side effects, they called and we managed them. But many times they took upon themselves to say, well, I'm going to stop it.
So what was the effect of going from that system to the new system with follow-up?
No, we went to a new system, I think, around the holiday season. I don't think we have seen follow-up. And then also we are trying to have all follow-ups come within a month to one single provider.
And what's the thinking behind that?
Just simply practicality. Just all of us are very busy clinic schedules. So we've identified one individual to manage the post-treatment, and this individual had availability on template, and we trained and just sort of managing once we initiated the treatment.
So I know you have no data on this, but do you have any sense of what that will do to the discontinuation rate?
I hope that it'll go down to what we have seen in the trial, 5-6%. Just because you're closely monitoring, and also if somebody gets nausea, giving some, promethazine or dose reductions. We have some tricks, right? Medicine is an art, so we may be able to do some of those things. I'm hoping discontinuations from 16%, we hope to reduce it at least by 50% to under 8%, maybe 5-6%.
That's fascinating, because one of the questions that I hear all the time, not from doctors, but elsewhere in my life, is, well, those clinical trials, they really underestimate the side effects, don't they? And what I hear you saying is that in this case, in your experience, just provide and forget. It wasn't that big a difference. 16% is not nothing, but it's not that much different in the scale of 100 patients than 5 or 6% is.
Yeah, but again, though, is in the clinical trial, Maestro trial, I think is like discontinuation was under 5% for 100 milligrams. Here you got 16%, that's 3 times as high. That is high. But I think there is a way, though, for a medication like Resmetirom. It is expensive. Patients need it. I think at least we learned that we can do a better job. We have done a very good job in terms of patient selection, how we prescribe it, but that's the beauty of research. You look at your experience and you tweak it, so, in the end, patients benefit.
So I think that covers pretty much what was in the paper. What else do you have to share about the experience you and your colleagues have had actually prescribing the drug?
I think an area that we've been careful is to avoid somehow this medication going to patients with cirrhosis, because the package insert label doesn't require a biopsy. So you are looking for presence or absence of cirrhosis based on NITs, your clinical assessment and, fibroscan and so forth. An area that we've been good I believe is with these NITs, and I think we pay attention to the liver stiffness, the platelet count, the albumin, and whether somebody is drinking excessively. So that's one that I think is really important to make sure you're not giving this to patients with cirrhosis, because this is still, the cirrhosis trial is ongoing, and especially if you go to Child's B, the pharmacokinetics of Resmetirom may be different. So your audience, that's what I would urge, is to make sure that if they aren't hepatologists, but if things don't quite line up for lack of cirrhosis, seeking a hepatologist opinion, even curbsiding them, I think would be good for patient care.
What steps did you take to ascertain who was drinking excessively?
We haven't quite gone on to PET testing on everybody yet. It's just how ethically you tell the patients. So we are mostly self-reported basis, but we have experience. We've been in the alcohol-associated liver disease research for a couple of decades. So we believe collectively we can get the history of alcohol consumption in a non-threatening way, in a non-accusatory way. So I think it's largely self-reporting. Still you're going to have some patients who underreport, but we have not gone to PET, certainly not ethyl triglycerides in the urine in this population. We do in the transplant setting. And we have not considered consistently gone to audit, and I think we're discussing recently about doing on every patient an audit every year.
Okay. So you say we've been doing this a long time, so patients tell us what they tell us, but we have a sense of when that's right and when that's not. What could a listener take away from this conversation about how to determine that better?
You may not get all the details the first visit, Roger. You need to establish a trusting relationship. Once you have a trusting relationship, and I'm just saying in my 25 years of practice, maybe just a handful of instances, after repeated questioning, patients were not forthcoming. They always do. I mean, they understand. The first time it is, you just don't have a relationship. So doesn't mean they don't underreport. They do. But I think, at least the place where we practice, generally speaking, when we have a trusting relationship with our patients, they are forthcoming and, we have not been misled.
Sounds fantastic. And how long are your average visits, by the way?
A new patient, good 45 minutes, Roger. The second visit, we probably do 30 minutes. This is the second time. When people are coming every 6 months, patients with cirrhosis, I see them every 4 to 6 months. And patients with non-cirrhotic, 8 months to 10 months time range. And follow-ups, where I know their history very well, including their family and everything, I would say 20 minutes gives a really very satisfactory. Generally speaking, our rule of thumb is that patients, when they leave their doctor's offices, they just feel like they should be satisfied. They had their questions answered. We've been able to really accomplish that.
If you can get to 20 to 30 minutes, that's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever been rushed to do 10 minutes. And you have mixture. Some patients only need 10 minutes, so you always sort of average this out. But our templates are 20 minutes though for follow-up. For new patients, it's 45 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes.
That's great. What else should I be asking you about this paper or about how you folks are treating that you believe colleagues listening to this podcast might want to, or drug companies for that matter, might want to understand?
I just think, though, after a decade of negative results, and I think for MASH therapeutics, this seems like truly exciting. We have Resmetirom approved. We all have seen excellent results from the Essence trial with semaglutide. I'm sure you have that discussed. And then more recently, we have the results from the SYMMETRY trial with the FGF-21 analogs. There's a lot of excitement. And still, I would say, though, paying attention to cardiovascular morbidity is really critical. Even in patients with MASH cirrhosis, stage 3 fibrosis, second most common cause of death is cardiovascular disease. So making sure their lipids are thoroughly managed. They're not smoking. Their diabetes is well controlled. So that's, treating the patients comprehensively is really important. I just can't emphasize enough about the management of lipids. They have dyslipidemia. Many patients walk around with an LDL 120 to 150. They have many primary care providers think if you keep LDL over 100, it's fine. But the problem is many of our patients have low HDL. So the LDL to HDL ratio isn't favorable. So just making sure that their LDL is low, they're adequately treated, their lipids are treated, and just get exercise, the muscle mass, and just the good medical care is really essential.
Interesting. Do your folks prescribe GLP-1s?
We do, but not the same way. We are not set up to do GLP-1s in liver clinics. We have a medically supervised weight loss program. So some of our patients go there and they have a program set up to prescribe and dispense GLP-1s.
Okay, so then in fact, the hepatologists do not prescribe, the bariatricians or whoever is in the obesity clinic too?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. This has been fantastic. I look forward to having you back on and talking about other papers and broader issues. Have a great day.
Finally, this week's expert is hepatologist and key opinion leader Scott Friedman. Scott focuses on two trends in basic research: the increasing acceptance of gene therapy as a safe and acceptable way to treat some liver disease, and a better understanding of the subgroups of MASH. So
this week's expert interview is with our good friend Scott Friedman, who has always been a significant draw. We will have 20 minutes or 30 minutes of just Scott and me chatting about whatever he thinks is important and compelling in the science of liver disease right now. Scott, how are you today?
I'm great, Roger. Always great to be with you.
It's fun. It's springtime in Manhattan, huh?
Finally, we had a week where the temperature hovered between freezing and 40 degrees, so anything warmer than that is spring.
Well, congratulations on surviving that week. There's been plenty to survive recently, as we were just discussing. So what do you bring to us today to educate our people about the science of liver?
Well, very promising signs in liver disease in general and in MASH in particular. A couple of big trends. One is the acceptance of gene therapy as a safe and acceptable way to treat some liver diseases, particularly genetic liver diseases. You have to remember that the first foray into gene therapy about 15 years ago ended in catastrophe with the unfortunate death of a young man who was in a clinical trial in University of Pennsylvania, and that put a chill on the field better than 10 years. Behind the scenes, the technology continued to be developed, matured, safety assured, and now we really have both approved and developing therapies to change or edit the DNA sequence of patients with genetic diseases in particular, but now also in MASH. So I think as a general, both in liver and in other diseases, but particularly in liver, is an extremely exciting and almost futuristic notion. I say particularly liver because the liver is ripe more than almost any other organ to accept gene therapy and allow it to change the outcomes for patients with liver disease driven by altered genetics. So that's exciting.
So examples of recent studies or recent literature that has driven this point home? Or shown where it can go?
Well, certainly one can consider even hemophilia's gene therapy because they have a defective clotting factor made by the liver, and so those look extremely promising for the most part. Treatment for porphyria with gene therapy as well as alpha-1 antitrypsin is coming along. So these are mostly monogenic diseases, but at the same time you have gene therapies to change the predominant sequence of proteins or genes that are implicated in MASH. So for example, there's a gene that was discovered some years ago called PNPLA3 that has two variants, a good variant and a bad variant. If you have the good variant, you're unlikely to develop fat and inflammation in the liver. If you have the other variant, I wouldn't call it bad, just another variant, it predisposes you to develop more MASH if you have other risk factors. So what companies have done is say, well, let's try to introduce the protective gene variant in patients with gene therapy, and the early results look very promising. But it suggests now that variants in genes, rather than just diseases caused by genes, are also a target for gene therapy. So I'm super excited, and really just the beginning.
So not that one can predict this stuff, but what kind of path do you think we're looking at here? How long will it be before gene therapies themselves start to be used in MASH, and what do you see their role as being over time, would you guess?
Yeah, well, as you know, there's a solid process for evaluating drugs, phase 1, 2, and 3. As far as I know, those gene therapies are still in phase 2. So we've got probably a few years before they have been expanded to enroll hundreds rather than dozens of patients to prove that it's safe and effective. But I think that within 5 years, if not sooner, we'll see some breakthroughs in gene therapy. How it will be used among the many options we have for therapy, I think, remains to be seen. It could be that a single injection or delivery of a gene could exert a benefit for months or even years, as is the case with some other kinds of therapies. There's also a gene therapy, by the way, that's attempting to inject long-term expression of FGF-21, which, as you know, is on the list of promising conventional therapies. But here, the company is saying, let's put it in the muscle and let it pump out FGF-21 indefinitely and see if we can do it with one shot. My guess is they'll assess how effective and how durable a response is with just the therapy, and then determine if add-on therapies of more conventional types that we know more about are included in the treatment regimen.
That's pretty exceptional stuff. So last year, maybe 2 years ago, we were talking about the idea of miRNA and the role that might play. Now, that's not exactly gene therapy, but it's kind of in the neighborhood, if you will. Have you seen any more on that? Has there been any progress on that?
Well, that is, I think most people would consider that gene therapy, in that you're injecting genetic material. miRNA therapies, as you know, and maybe your listeners know as well, is a technology that's a variant of conventional gene therapy, but here you're injecting special pieces of RNA, usually, that turns off a gene.
We were talking about heart failure a couple of years ago, I think, or something cardiovascular, I forget what it was, and the possibility of liver as well.
I think what you're referring to is CAR T therapy. It's a cell-based therapy. So in one way or another, either by administering exogenous specialized T cells or by programming those T cells within the body to attack target cells and clear them by expressing an antigen on the CAR T that specifically recognizes that target on the susceptible cell. So CAR Ts look promising in cardiac fibrosis, and all I can say for now, although there's a lot more known, the CAR T therapies in liver, I think, have great promise. And, that raises a number of questions. Let's say if you're successful in depleting a stellate cell, which ones do you want to get rid of? How long do you want that effect to last? And we know from studies that were performed initially, both in my lab and with a former postdoc in her lab, that if you take out all stellate cells in the liver, that's not a good thing. That's supported by a beautiful study recently in Nature from Robert Schwabe and his team at Columbia, along with many others, that showed that the stellate cell, the healthy stellate cell, the fibrogenic cell in the liver, the healthy stellate cell is a critical source of a growth factor that supports hepatocyte regeneration. So it suggests that one has to be very careful about which cells one depletes using CAR T therapies. Otherwise, you'll get in trouble by depleting cells that will keep the liver healthy. That, in turn, speaks to the explosion of information about gene expression in single cells. I probably said this on a prior podcast, but to me, the technologies that have enabled us to assess characterize the genome or the transcriptome of individual cells, both when you isolate them, but also in situ. Those technologies are unbelievably powerful in not only helping us understand how cells talk to one another and which cells talk to one another, but also how many different flavors of every cell type there is. So when we first discovered or isolated stellate cells in the 80s, we were very excited to suggest that there was quiescent cells, there were activated cells, and then later work from Robert Schwabe and Tatiana Kisarova uncovered the fact that there were also deactivated stellate cells. It turns out there's many flavors between those different stages, and they serve different functions. And so we're beginning to understand that not just for stellate cells, but also endothelial cells, hepatocytes, inflammatory or immune cells, there are, in some cases, many dozen or more, probably even more, subtypes of different cell types, each of which may have a different role. To return to Robert Schwabe's lovely work, he had a separate paper, I think about 3 years ago, that showed that stellate cells can either promote or prevent liver cancer. So it depends on which flavor of stellate cells is most dominant in it. But the broader point is that there are now technologies that allow us to understand at the finest imaginable detail what genes are expressed by cells and how those cells talk to other cells. And what it's uncovering are a lot of subtle pathways that we just never appreciated before that influence liver function.
So that's one arena right now where exciting things are happening. What are you working on in your lab that you're comfortable sharing that people might find interesting?
Well, truth be told, we are working on CAR T cells in liver, and we have some super exciting data that's not yet in the public domain, but hope will get out there in the not too distant future. So that's one thing. The other is a receptor that we discovered on very advanced activated stellate cells that we think is particularly important in driving the cells to make more fibrosis at the end stages of disease rather than at the early stages of disease. And to come back to the concept of different flavors, or what we call heterogeneity of stellate cells, we're learning that there are different subsets of stellate cells that are more or less fibrogenic, as well as more or less cancer-producing. And we're focused on one flavor of stellate cells that is particularly important when the fibrosis becomes very advanced. So it may be that treatments for MASH or other progressive fibrotic diseases may differ depending on whether the disease is early, intermediate, or late, because the features of the late or cirrhotic liver are very unique and different. And it may well be that treatments work perfectly well in an F2 fibrosis are going to be ineffective in F4 fibrosis because the nature of the scar as well as the distortion of the liver are far more advanced in the cirrhotic patient than in the patient without cirrhosis.
That would follow logically, virtually logically, right? We know that some drugs appear to be able to have some benefit in F4 based on some phase 3 trials and others might not. That in and of itself would suggest that something different is going on at that stage of disease. If the goal is to target cirrhosis, how far are we along in the ability to know how to do that using these kinds of processes?
Well, there's two ways to think about it. One is how durable is cirrhosis if you cure the underlying disease, and for that we already have ample and very solid evidence in the case of hepatitis C or B. If you cure hepatitis C in a patient with cirrhosis that's not too advanced, then that's an important qualifier. If you cure hep C, even cirrhotic patients will regress massive scar and go back to either low fibrosis or no fibrosis, which speaks to the liver's absolutely unique capacity to regenerate and get rid of scar. So that we can already do. Of course, the bigger question is, what about in MASH with cirrhosis? We're not curing the disease with any of these therapies. We're attenuating some of the drivers of the disease, so that the notion of cure is not really applicable here the way it is in viral hepatitis. Certainly the FGF-21s have taken the lead in showing the most promise cirrhosis, but that still leaves us with the question of when is cirrhosis simply too advanced such that even an effective therapy won't reverse the scar. We're doing some modeling of that in my liver. I have a very talented visiting scientist from Brazil, Bruno Cogliatti, and he's using a very advanced model of cirrhosis for MASH to determine whether there comes a point where if you stop the MASH, the fibrosis goes away. And his model does suggest that, at least in mouse liver, and I know in human liver as well, there is what we call a point of no return. Even if you do everything right, with all the signals, the scar is too embedded in the liver and too cross-linked chemically and resistant to degradation, and you'll be stuck with that scar forever.
I'm presuming that patient would be pretty sick already.
Yes, absolutely. Those are patients with advanced and often decompensated cirrhosis who might otherwise be on a transplant.
Okay, good. For them, not a lot of help, but for patients with earlier stage cirrhosis, maybe things we can do, or appear to be things we can do that we're learning back over the next few years.
Just how do you distinguish those patients without just simply treating and seeing if they get better? In other words, is there some marker either in their blood or even if you take liver tissue that says once you have this marker present, that denotes irreversible stage? We don't have that kind of a marker. The best we can do is if the patient has portal hypertension, particularly, what's called the hepatic venous pressure gradient of greater than, say, 14 or so, that seems to be a point at which reversibility seems less likely, even in hepatitis C.
So we've talked a little bit about genes, a little bit about cirrhosis. The other one that I always keep an eye on is so-called lean MASH. I keep an eye on it because A, it doesn't seem to be as metabolic in the same way that others are, and B, because where we've been able to isolate it, it seems to have a faster progression, therefore greater cost and less time to get on top of it. Are we learning anything about that?
Not really, but I'll pivot a little bit and answer a slightly different question that this reflects, which is the idea that there are different forms of MASH. Now, we don't know that from what it looks like in the microscope. We use standard scoring system regardless of why we think the patient has MASH, but what we're clearly learning, and there's been a couple of terrific papers, one by Stefano Romeo that was in Nature Medicine in the last year, that suggests that there are subgroups of MASH that have different disease drivers. One may be more diabetes and cardiovascular risk, others that may have other features that distinguish them. And the reason I separate these different subtypes is because they may have different responsiveness to drugs. And to a certain extent, that's a very satisfying explanation because it seems that there's no drug that everybody with MASH responds to. So we have to explain why some patients have a brisk response and some have a sluggish or sometimes no response. And it will be that they have different molecular drivers of the disease that merit different therapeutic targets or have different therapeutic targets that merit different therapies. So that's something we're still trying to work out. I mean, right now it's basically all comers in a clinical trial and we see how many patients get better. But we may get to a point where we're only going to treat certain patients that have features that we know will make them more responsive to drug A, and we're getting them.
So what else should I be asking about today?
Well, on a sobering note, we're in a very challenging time in the United States with regard to research support and research funding. And I've been in this business over 40 years, and I think it's safe to say we've never seen such a wholesale threat to the viability of scientific research and the integrity of research as we are now in many sectors. And I don't want to get political. I do want to advocate for how important it is to invest in science in any form or in any way, both by supporting clinical studies but also by basic research. One can glibly say, yeah, well, the pharmaceutical companies have a lot of money, why don't we just depend on them? But the kind of research they do, albeit very important and high quality typically, is nonetheless very directed research. They want to know if this drug in this disease is going to help. The power of the kind of funding that people like me have depended on, that it's discovery science. You start asking question A and you end up with an answer to a question you didn't initially ask that in some ways is even more important. And that's what advocates of continuing support for NIH have argued, is that we really need to continue to invest in more, quote, basic science, because discoveries from there ultimately change the world of medicine. Probably the clearest example I can think of is CRISPR-Cas9. So it's a gene editing technology. It was developed by Jennifer Doudna and Isabelle Carpentier. Terrific book, by the way, a biography of Jennifer Doudna by Walter Erickson. I highly recommend Isaacson.
Fantastic book.
But, that was a system, people were studying bacteria, for God's sake, but they discovered that these bacteria had a system to ward off invading pathogens by chipping away or clipping their DNA and making them inactive. And that was translated into a discovery that ultimately has been the most profound advance in gene therapy and gene editing in the history of science. So, come back to my general point. We're all interested in living longer and better, and all of those advances start with basic laboratories often looking for something else to hit upon new exciting discoveries that drug companies can pick up on and ultimately translate into a treatment. So I'm not minimizing in any way the important partnership with the pharmaceutical and quite the contrary. But including GLP-1, most recent therapies were developed in basic science labs, or at least this underlying biology that led to those therapies. GLP-1 is one example where the initial discovery came sometimes serendipitously in academic labs, and then by mutual consent they were transitioned over to pharmaceutical companies to make a drug that saves patients' lives. I mean, the other example, of course, is statins. Probably saved my life and many others who are at risk for cardiovascular disease, and that was discovered because investigators were looking for pathways that regulated cholesterol transport in the liver. From that arose what is probably the most ubiquitously used drug class in the world.
Although the GLP-1s might have a shot at getting close to them over time.
Yeah, well, that's another issue. The GLP-1s are increasingly establishing themselves as kind of a baseline therapy, and when we design clinical trials, we have to assume that many, if not most patients will have GLP-1. You can't take them off it. You just need to account for it as you randomize patients to ideally hope that there's an equal number of patients on GLP-1s in both the treatment and the control groups. Apart from concern about loss of muscle mass, the GLP-1s cure whatever ails you, everything from sleep apnea to osteoarthritis and possibly even neurodegenerative diseases. So, yeah, GLP-1s are unbelievable. And there's a very interesting article written by a graduate of my medical school and former dean of Harvard, Jeff Flyer, pointing out that the actual availability and discovery of GLP-1s for use in patients was made over 15 years ago. And it took a while for anybody to pay enough attention to get this into the mainstream.
Not having seen that particular paper, why do you think it was? I've done enough work on the statins to know what it was that slowed their initial uptake.
Well, I mean, it was simply a decision by a pharmaceutical company that said this doesn't look like a promising avenue and we're just not going to invest in it. And they're sometimes right and they're sometimes wrong. In this case, they were wrong.
I had the opportunity to work on pre-launch, 2 to 3 years pre-launch on liraglutide, which we did a little bit of work on exenatide also. We did more work on liraglutide. And to convey the idea that if the drug has two benefits, you don't say, well, we're going to call it A or we're going to call it B, but you have to find some way to explain that A and B are intertwined in the real benefit of the drug. It's a very, very hard thing to communicate.
Sure. Communication is critical both to providers and to patients.
What they had going for them there, though, was that they had enough impact on glycohemoglobin that you clearly knew at the end the result was significant.
Yeah, for sure. Well, if you're improving diabetes, you're going to fix a lot of things related to it. Heart disease probably much as well.
And the first talk I ever gave at a liver meeting was actually about the statins and the idea that what boosted the statins was proof of outcomes, which is going to be really hard to do here fast enough.
Yeah. Disease is so much more prevalent that they can do phase 3 trials with thousands of patients where the statistical power is undeniable, and once the drug looks like it keeps patients alive longer, that's as hard and important an outcome as you could want.
So it's interesting, right? Because MASH is also significantly prevalent, if not equally significantly.
Sure, and actually there's recent studies that reinforce what had been reported earlier, that patients who are on statins seem to have a reduced risk of hepatocellular carcinoma. So just to emphasize something that providers should know by now, statins are safe in patients with liver disease. Hopefully there are no more primary care or general providers that are withholding statins in their patients with liver disease for fear it's going to make the liver worse. That's not appropriate unless there's some definitive history of intolerance to a specific statin. In general, statins are safe and beneficial.
Okay. Scott, this has been fantastic. You take care. Have a good summer. We'll be doing this again in a couple of months.
Okay.
Let's throw up more chestnuts for people. Thank you so much, sir. Enjoy your day. Bye-bye now.
And here's the Season 6, Episode 5 business report.
Slava Ukraini, Kharim Slava. It's hard to find Ukraine news among all the smoke that Trump raises in Washington every day, but he did make a statement yesterday claiming that Ukraine started this war. As we all know, that's false. As you can hear, I don't have much voice, so I'm going to ask some of the AI voice friends that we use every week for headlines and sections to take over.
The V2.0 segments have been well received. Hi, I'm Mark. In the first 6 days after last week's episode dropped, the expert segments have performed extremely well, independent of the overall episodes. In fact, last week's expert segment has a higher number of audited downloads than the main episode, although we're fairly confident the overall episode received more listens.
The next few weeks present only one possible challenge.
Hi, I'm Jessica. We have already discussed the schedule through the end of May. The only possible problem will come if Roger's voice does not recover sufficiently by next week. AI voices like me can read a script, but we can't interview or moderate discussions. If Roger doesn't have a voice, things may be pushed back a week. Let's hope not.
Hi, I'm Hope. Since this isn't Roger's real voice, we'll keep this short. Thanks for listening, and if you have feedback for Roger on how great we sound, or even something less complimentary, please let him know.
And that wraps up Season 6, Episode 5 of Surfing the MASH Tsunami. On behalf of the surfers, our guests, and our sponsors, Liver Right and Taoisean Health, thanks for joining us this week.
Please join us again next week when we continue our roundtable on advances in drug development in the last year, and dedicate the rest of our episode to honoring the memory of Stephen Harrison on the first anniversary of his passing.
And until then, stay safe, surf on, and we'll see you next week on Surfing the MASH Tsunami. Bye-bye now.